Parents shame daughter for dating a black man until they learn his true identity. Jessica Whitmore had always been the golden child. Raised in an affluent, traditional suburban family, she embodied everything her parents, Richard and Margaret Whitmore, had worked for: Ivy League education, polished manners, and a bright future in corporate law. But nothing could have prepared her parents for the moment she introduced them to her boyfriend, Daniel Carter. Jessica had been nervous all week. She knew her parents weren't exactly progressive when it came to race, even if they liked to pretend they were open-minded. But now, after months of dating Daniel in secret, it was time for the big reveal. The moment Daniel stepped into the Whitmore family home, she felt the tension in the air tighten. Margaret's polite smile faltered, and Richard's handshake was stiff, his eyes betraying a mixture of surprise and disapproval. They exchanged pleasantries, but the underlying coldness was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, as Daniel excused himself to take a phone call, Margaret pulled Jessica aside, her voice a harsh whisper. "Honey, we need to talk." Jessica's stomach churned. "About what?" Margaret sighed dramatically. "You know about what." "A black man, Jessica. You could date anyone. Why him?" Jessica's jaw clenched. "Because I love him, Mom, and I thought you'd care about the person he is, not his skin color." Her father joined in, his voice laced with frustration. "Jessica, think about your future. Think about our family name. People talk." Jessica felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "So what you're saying is, you'd rather I be with someone white, even if they treated me terribly, just to protect your image?" Richard scoffed. "It's about compatibility. He's from a different world, Jessica. He won't understand our values. Our legacy." Jessica shook her head, disgusted. "I thought you raised me to judge people by their character. But I see now that was just a convenient lie." She stormed out, leaving her parents fuming in their own ignorance. Over the next few weeks, the Whitmores made their disapproval known. Jessica received passive-aggressive texts from her mother, and her father barely spoke to her. At family gatherings, they purposefully avoided mentioning Daniel, as if ignoring his existence would make him disappear. When Jessica brought him up, Margaret would change the subject, and Richard would sigh as if she were talking about a phase she'd eventually outgrow. But Jessica refused to back down. She knew who Daniel was: a kind, intelligent, and deeply ambitious man. He treated her with more love and respect than anyone she'd ever met. If her parents couldn't see that, it was their loss. One evening, while visiting their house, Jessica overheard her parents whispering in the kitchen. "We should set her up with someone more suitable," Margaret murmured. "You mean white," Richard muttered back. Jessica's blood boiled. She had heard enough. She stepped into the kitchen, her voice steady but cold. "I can't believe you two. You're actually trying to replace my boyfriend?" Her parents turned, caught in the act. Margaret tried to compose herself. "We just want what's best for you, dear." "No," Jessica snapped. "You want what's best for you. And I'm done playing along." With that, she turned and left this time, for good. Months passed with barely any contact. Jessica focused on her relationship with Daniel, who continued to support her through the fallout. Then, one evening, Richard received a phone call from an old colleague, Charles Remington, a well-known business mogul. "Richard, my friend, I just got off a call with Daniel Carter. Brilliant young man. I hear your daughter is dating him?" Richard stiffened. Yes, they've been seeing each other." "Then he must be thrilled. The boy is practically royalty in the corporate world. His family name alone opens doors most people could only dream of." Richard frowned. "His family?" Remington chuckled. "You mean you don't know? Daniel Carter is the son of Gregory Carter." Richard's breath hitched. Gregory Carter was a multi-billionaire, a self-made business titan whose influence stretched across industries. His philanthropy had changed entire cities, his business acumen admired worldwide. Wait, that Gregory Carter? Richard whispered, his stomach twisting. The very same, Remington confirmed. Daniel is poised to take over the empire. Your daughter is quite lucky. Richard hung up in shock. His mind raced. The son of Gregory Carter? The heir to one of the largest financial legacies in the country. He called Margaret immediately. We need to talk. That weekend, the Whitmores suddenly insisted on having Jessica and Daniel over for dinner. Jessica was skeptical, but Daniel, ever the gentleman, agreed. As soon as they arrived, her parents were almost unrecognizably warm. Margaret fawned over Daniel, asking about his interests, his work, his family. Jessica saw through it immediately. Cut the act, she said flatly. Margaret feigned innocence. What act? Jessica crossed her arms. You found out who his father is, didn't you? Her parents exchanged guilty glances. Richard cleared his throat. Jessica, we may have misjudged the situation. Jessica scoffed. So let me get this straight. When you thought Daniel was just a regular black man, he wasn't good enough. But now that you know he's from a wealthy black family, suddenly he's acceptable. Margaret bristled. That's not fair. No, what's not fair, Jessica shot back, is that you never actually cared about who Daniel is. You just cared about his status. Daniel, who had been silent, finally spoke. With all due respect, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I don't need your approval. I love Jessica for who she is, not because of her last name or her family's wealth. That's what real love looks like. Jessica squeezed his hand, proud of him. Her parents sat in awkward silence, forced to confront the truth of their own hypocrisy. Over time, Richard and Margaret were forced to reflect on their deep-seated biases. Their daughter's unwavering stance made them question whether their prejudices were worth losing her. Slowly, very slowly, they made efforts to truly know Daniel beyond his name. It wasn't easy, and Jessica never let them forget their initial reaction. But the lesson had been learned. Love is about who someone is, not what they have. A year later, when Daniel proposed to Jessica, it was on their terms. Not for approval, not for wealth, but for love one that stood tall, regardless of the world's expectations. And this time, when Jessica's parents attended the wedding, it wasn't out of obligation. It was because they had finally realized what truly mattered. A few weeks after the tense dinner with her parents, Jessica was invited to meet Daniel's family for the first time. Though she had known about his father's wealth and influence, Daniel rarely flaunted it. As their car pulled up to the Carter estate, Jessica's jaw dropped. The mansion, nestled on a sprawling estate with pristine gardens and a grand fountain, looked straight out of a luxury magazine. Welcome to my childhood, Daniel said with a small chuckle, squeezing her hand. Jessica swallowed hard. I don't know if I'm more nervous about meeting your parents or about not getting lost in this house. Daniel laughed. Just be yourself. That's all they'll care about. Inside, Jessica was greeted warmly by Daniel's mother, Evelyn Carter, a graceful woman whose presence radiated quiet authority. His father, Gregory Carter, was exactly as Jessica had imagined, commanding but kind, a man whose wisdom was evident in his every word. Over dinner, Evelyn spoke first. We've heard a lot about you, Jessica. Daniel has never spoken so highly of anyone. Jessica smiled nervously. I hope it's all good things. Gregory chuckled. Well, he told us how smart you are. We respect that. Our family values intellect, perseverance, and above all, character. Jessica's heart swelled with relief. Unlike her own parents, the Carters judged her on who she was, not on status or race. Now, Evelyn said, leaning in slightly, tell us about your family. Jessica hesitated. Well, they're traditional. Gregory exchanged a knowing glance with his wife. So they weren't thrilled when they found out Daniel was black? Jessica sighed. No, they weren't. They changed their tune once they found out who you were. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. People like that always do. But Jessica, let me ask you something. Jessica straightened. Yes? Do you think they'll truly accept Daniel for him? Or just the version of him they find acceptable? Jessica swallowed. I don't know, but I hope they will. Gregory nodded. Hope is good, but boundaries are better. Jessica's parents began bragging about Daniel as if their initial disgust had never happened. At social events, Margaret casually dropped, "Oh, our daughter is dating Daniel Carter," emphasizing his last name with pride. Jessica finally confronted her mother. Do you even hear yourself? You went from ashamed to boasting just because of his family name. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Jessica, we're just proud of your good taste. Jessica shook her head. No, you're proud of his status. But what if he were just a teacher, or an artist, or God forbid a regular black man? Margaret frowned. Why does that matter? We like him now. Jessica's patience snapped. It matters because you never cared about who he actually was. You shamed me for loving him until you realized he was wealthy. Margaret's face paled. Richard, who had been silent, cleared his throat. Jessica, we've been adjusting. Give us some time. Jessica crossed her arms. Then prove it. One weekend, Jessica invited her parents to a charity event Daniel was organizing for underprivileged schools. The event was held in a local community center far from the luxury her parents were accustomed to. Richard and Margaret arrived, clearly uncomfortable. They avoided shaking hands for too long, subtly wiping their palms on their clothes after greetings. Jessica watched them closely. They were here, but were they truly learning? Daniel, ever the gracious host, walked up to them. I'm glad you both came. Margaret forced a smile. Of course, dear. Daniel gestured to a group of children. These kids are from low-income families. We're raising funds for better classrooms and school supplies. Margaret and Richard glanced at each other. That's commendable, Richard said hesitantly. Jessica stepped forward. Mom, Dad, I want you to meet Mrs. Johnson. She's a retired teacher who has been mentoring these kids for years. An elderly black woman approached, her kind eyes twinkling. Pleasure to meet you both, she said, extending her hand. Richard hesitated for half a second before shaking it. Margaret followed suit. Throughout the evening, Jessica noticed subtle changes. Her parents were stiff at first, but as they interacted with more people, their expressions softened. They began listening, asking questions, engaging. And for the first time, Jessica saw hope. A year later, Daniel proposed. Jessica said yes immediately, but she knew what was coming. Her parents, though more accepting, still had their reservations. Margaret sighed dramatically when Jessica told her, Are you sure? Marriage is a big commitment. Jessica crossed her arms. I'm not asking for permission. Richard frowned. Just promise us you'll sign a prenup. You have to be smart about these things. Jessica was stunned. You think he's after my money? He's wealthier than we are. Margaret fidgeted. Well, you never know. Jessica stood firm. I love him, and you either support this marriage or you don't. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. Fine, we'll support you. Jessica looked into his eyes. Then act like it. On the day of the wedding, as Jessica stood in her gown, Margaret entered her dressing room. Margaret hesitated. You look beautiful. Jessica softened. Thank you, Mom. Margaret took a deep breath. I was wrong. About Daniel. About a lot of things. Jessica turned fully to face her. Margaret's voice wavered. When I saw you fighting for him for what's right, I realized how ugly my own thoughts were. And I hated that they were mine. Tears pricked Jessica's eyes. Then don't just say it, Mom. Be better. Margaret nodded. I will. The ceremony was stunning, but the real beauty was in what followed. Her parents, sitting beside Daniel's family, Not just tolerating, but embracing. Jessica smiled. Real change takes time, but it's possible. And as she walked down the aisle toward the love of her life, she knew she had won, not just for herself, but for a future where love always triumphed over prejudice. Even after the wedding, Jessica knew her parents still carried some lingering prejudice. No matter how much they tried to hide it, it became evident a few months later when Margaret invited Jessica to lunch at an upscale country club. Jessica noticed the tension immediately when she walked in with Daniel. The club was old money, exclusively white. Margaret had chosen this place on purpose, perhaps to test how people would react. As Daniel pulled out Jessica's chair like a gentleman, Margaret's friends exchanged glances. Jessica's stomach turned. One of the women, a sleek blonde in pearls, leaned in toward Margaret and whispered, "Oh, is that Jessica's husband?" Margaret hesitated before forcing a smile. "Yes, that's Daniel." The woman's lips curled. "Well, isn't that interesting?" Jessica heard it. That undertone of judgment. She watched her mother carefully. Margaret stiffened, her face flushing. And then, instead of dismissing the woman's passive-aggressive racism, she laughed along with her friends. Jessica's heart sank. Daniel reached for her hand under the table, his grip gentle. He had heard it too. Jessica clenched her jaw, pushing back her chair. "We're leaving." Margaret's eyes widened. "Jessica, don't be dramatic." "No," Jessica said sharply. "You just failed the final test, Mom. You said you changed. But when it came time to actually stand up for us, you didn't." Margaret looked away, embarrassed. Jessica's voice wavered. "If you ever want to see me again, you'll need to prove that you deserve to be in my life." With that, Jessica and Daniel walked out, leaving Margaret alone forced to sit with the consequences of her own cowardice. 2 weeks later, Richard Whitmore's company faced major controversy. It was leaked to the media that Whitmore Industries had been denying promotions to qualified black employees for decades. A lawsuit followed. It was ugly. Jessica was horrified. "Dad, tell me this isn't true." Richard sighed. "It's complicated." Jessica's stomach churned. "No, it's not. You built your empire by holding people like Daniel back. People who earned their success." Richard rubbed his temples. "Jessica, it was never about race. It was about protecting the company culture." Jessica laughed bitterly. "Dad, do you even hear yourself? That's just fancy wording for racism." Margaret, who had remained silent, looked shaken. For the first time, she saw it clearly. This wasn't just a society problem. It was their problem. Jessica's voice cracked. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." Richard looked genuinely ashamed. And for the first time in his life, he questioned everything. Over the next few months, Richard fought to save his company's reputation. But something unexpected happened. As he spent more time actually listening to the black employees, hearing their struggles, learning about systemic racism, and confronting his own prejudices, he changed. He started mentoring young black professionals in his company. He publicly apologized for past injustices and restructured leadership, ensuring equal opportunities for everyone. It wasn't about image anymore. It was about doing the right thing. Margaret, too, underwent her own transformation. She cut ties with racist social circles. She stood up for Jessica and Daniel at public events, refusing to let whispers of prejudice slide. And, most importantly, she reached out to Daniel, truly getting to know him beyond his family name. On their first wedding anniversary, Jessica and Daniel were invited to a family gathering. Jessica was hesitant. Was this another empty gesture? But when they arrived, something was different. Margaret greeted Daniel first, not with a stiff handshake, but with a warm, genuine hug. Richard walked up to Daniel and apologized, not just with words, but with actions. I used to believe I knew best, Richard admitted, but I see now that I had so much to learn. Jessica's throat tightened. This was real. Her parents had finally changed. And for the first time in her life, Jessica felt proud of them. Years later, Jessica and Daniel had a daughter of their own. As they watched their parents, once blinded by prejudice, embrace their granddaughter with unconditional love, Jessica whispered to Daniel, "We did it." Daniel smiled. "No, you did it. Because love had won, and it always would." Just when Jessica thought her parents had fully changed, an unexpected visitor disrupted their peace. At a high-profile charity gala, an old acquaintance approached Margaret. It was Helen Davenport, a woman who had once been part of her exclusive social circle. "Oh, Margaret, darling." Helen greeted with a forced smile. Her eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to Margaret. "I heard about the transformation in your family." Margaret tensed. "Helen, this is my son-in-law, Daniel Carter." Helen barely nodded at Daniel before turning back to Margaret. "Margaret, be honest. Do you really feel comfortable with all this? Surely you must miss how things used to be." Jessica, who had overheard the conversation, clenched her fists. But before she could react, Margaret did something shocking. She turned to Helen, her expression cold and firm. "I don't miss anything," Margaret said. "And quite frankly, I pity you, Helen, because you'll never understand what it means to grow." Helen's face twisted in shock. Margaret didn't wait for a response. She turned to Daniel and looped her arm through his. "Come, son, let's enjoy the evening." Daniel smiled. And for the first time, Jessica's heart soared. Margaret had passed the ultimate test, not when people were watching, but when she had everything to lose. When Daniel and Jessica announced their first pregnancy, it became national news. As a successful power couple, Daniel, a prominent businessman, and Jessica, a rising social advocate, their relationship was under a microscope. Most of the media coverage was positive, but then one article surfaced with the headline, "Billionaire heir Daniel Carter marries a white woman. Betrayal or progress?" The article painted Daniel as a sellout for not marrying a black woman, accusing Jessica of benefiting from white privilege, even in an interracial relationship. Jessica was devastated. "Why are they attacking you?" she asked Daniel. "We fought so hard to prove we belong together." Daniel sighed. "Because racism isn't just one-sided. Some people see interracial love as betrayal." Jessica wiped away tears. "But we love each other. Shouldn't that be enough?" Daniel kissed her forehead. "We'll show them that love is enough." They didn't respond to the media storm. Instead, they kept living their truths, and slowly, the world followed. Years later, Jessica and Daniel's daughter, Amelia Carter, grew into a brilliant, confident young woman. One day, she came home from school looking angry. Jessica knelt beside her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Amelia hesitated before blurting out, "Someone at school said I'm not black enough or white enough." Jessica's heart broke. Daniel sat beside Amelia. "Sweetheart, listen to me. You don't have to choose one side. You are both." "You are everything." Amelia sniffled. "But what if people don't accept me?" Jessica cupped her face. "Then they don't deserve you." Amelia wiped her tears. "So I can just be... Daniel smiled. "Exactly." And in that moment, the next generation was ready to break the cycle. Years later, at Richard and Margaret's 50th anniversary party, Jessica watched something unthinkable. Her parents, who once rejected Daniel, stood in front of a diverse crowd of family, friends, and colleagues. Richard raised a glass. "I used to believe in tradition over love," he admitted. "But my daughter taught me that love is the tradition worth keeping." Margaret took his hand. "We are proud of our family, of who we've become." Jessica's eyes welled up. Her parents had truly changed. Not just in words, but in their hearts. And for the first time, she realized this was the happy ending she never thought she'd get. Decades later, an elderly Jessica and Daniel sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play. Jessica sighed contentedly. "Can you believe where we started?" Daniel chuckled. "And look where we are now." Their love had changed their families. Their love had changed history. And in the end, love had won. Years after settling into their family life, Daniel received an unexpected opportunity that would once again test their relationship, both personally and professionally. He was offered a leadership role at an international nonprofit dedicated to racial equality and economic empowerment. The position was prestigious, leading global initiatives, meeting influential political figures, and guiding policy changes across multiple countries. However, accepting the position meant relocating to a new country, far from the familiar comforts of home. Jessica, now a renowned social advocate in her own right, had already begun establishing a flourishing career as a public speaker and writer. The offer seemed almost too good to pass up, but it came with challenges. Could they uproot their family once again, especially after everything they'd fought for? "What if we change everything, Daniel? What if we leave behind everything we've built here?" Jessica asked, sitting with him late one evening. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand. "This has always been bigger than us, Jessica. Think of what we could do on a global scale. Imagine the doors we could open." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. She couldn't help but think of the powerful impact they could have. But it wasn't just about their professional ambitions. It was about the future they envisioned for their children. "We'll do it," she said with conviction. "If we're going to create change, it's time we expanded our reach." And so, the decision was made. They relocated overseas, embarking on a new chapter that would challenge them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Upon settling in Europe, Jessica and Daniel quickly realized how different the environment was from the world they'd left behind. The politics around race were more openly complex, and their relationship was met with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and sometimes outright hostility. Jessica faced uncomfortable questions from peers and colleagues. "Why do you think you can fix what's broken here? And do you really believe love is enough to change this deeply rooted issue?" Daniel, too, found himself navigating the awkward dynamics of being both a foreigner and a person of color in spaces that had historically catered to a specific racial group. Their children, raised in a multicultural home, had to grapple with their identity in an environment that often felt divided. At their new school, Amelia was labeled as too American by some, too European by others. The same question of belonging surfaced once more, and the challenge felt more global this time. Despite the difficulties, Daniel and Jessica remained steadfast in their mission. Together, they hosted discussions on race relations, spoke at local events, and worked to bridge the gaps they saw in the community. Slowly but surely, they made their presence felt. One particular evening, at a gathering of international leaders, Daniel was invited to speak. It was an event focused on global equality and economic justice. Jessica accompanied him, fully aware of the weight of the situation. As Daniel took the stage, he saw a familiar face in the crowd, Helen Davenport. The same Helen who had once mocked him and Jessica. She was sitting in the front row now, visibly uncomfortable. Daniel felt a surge of confidence. This was his moment. He wasn't just representing his family, his community, or even his country. He was representing love and progress. "I stand here not as a man defined by my background, but by the choices I've made and the people who have stood beside me," he began, his voice steady. "My story isn't about wealth, status, or the color of my skin. It's about what we can achieve when we come together, when we move past what divides us." Helen's face turned red, and the room grew silent. She was forced to confront the very beliefs that had once shaped her worldview. After the speech, Jessica met Daniel backstage, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Daniel. You've just changed the conversation." Months later, the time came for them to return home to the United States, with their mission far from over. Their work had just begun, but their international experiences had opened their eyes to the global nature of the struggles they were fighting. As they landed back in America, they faced the realities of their old lives once more. Daniel's family had grown accustomed to being a source of strength and advocacy, and Jessica's parents were finally becoming deeply involved in the racial justice movements they had once been so dismissive of. However, there was still resistance. One evening, Jessica had an emotional conversation with her father, who admitted to having moments of doubt. "I thought I understood, Jess. I thought I had it all figured out, but now I see how much more work there is to do." Jessica reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all have a lot to learn, Dad, but the important thing is that we're learning together." Margaret, too, was beginning to volunteer in local community programs, stepping outside her comfort zone to teach others about equality, inclusion, and how to break down prejudices. She often asked Jessica for guidance on how to engage in meaningful conversations without alienating others. "It's not about correcting them, Mom," Jessica had said. "It's about making them see, helping them understand why the world needs to change." Margaret nodded, understanding at last. One warm afternoon, Jessica and Daniel returned to the country club where they had once faced the harsh judgment of old friends. This time, however, things were different. They were invited as honored guests at a charity gala held by the very same people who had once criticized them. Helen Davenport was there too, but now she greeted them with genuine warmth, her earlier reservations washed away by years of reflection. "I see now," she said, shaking Daniel's hand, "what true love and partnership can do. What we were so afraid of back then was something beautiful. I regret the way I treated you both." Daniel smiled graciously, his eyes full of understanding. "It's never too late to change." As the evening went on, Jessica looked around and saw the faces of her parents, Daniel's family, and friends who had supported them for years. It was a moment of triumph, not just because they had achieved success in their personal and professional lives, but because they had lived out a truth that was now impossible to deny. "Love will always find a way," Jessica whispered to Daniel, leaning in close. He kissed her cheek. "And when it does, nothing can stop it." Decades later, Daniel and Jessica sat together in their home, watching their grandchildren play. Amelia had followed in her parents' footsteps, becoming an advocate for racial justice and equality, and their younger children had grown into young adults who carried the same values. Looking out the window, Jessica and Daniel smiled. They had created a legacy, one not just of personal success, but of societal change. Their grandchildren would never know the struggles they faced, the whispers, the prejudice, the doubts. They would know only that love always wins, and that their grandparents had paved the way for a more inclusive world. As Daniel wrapped his arm around Jessica, he whispered, "We did good, didn't we?" Jessica smiled, her heart full. "We did more than good, Daniel. We changed the world." As the years went on, Jessica and Daniel's work continued to flourish. They had built an empire of positive change, speaking globally about the importance of racial justice, equity, and the healing power of love. Yet, despite their growing influence, new challenges emerged. One evening, Daniel received a disturbing message from an old acquaintance, an anonymous email containing racist threats directed toward him and his family. The message contained a chilling note. "You've gone too far. You're a traitor to your own kind." Jessica's heart raced when Daniel showed her the message. "This isn't just from a random person. This is from someone in our circles, someone who knows us," Daniel said grimly. They had already faced their fair share of prejudice in the past, but this felt different, more sinister. They'd achieved so much, and now, it seemed, their work had made them targets for people who saw their success as a threat. Daniel was torn. Should we step back, Jess, for our family's safety? Jessica shook her head. We've been through worse. We can't stop now. This is exactly why we have to keep pushing forward. But even as they continued their work, the constant threats took a toll on their mental health. They were no longer just fighting for their own lives. They were fighting for the next generation. One quiet evening, Jessica went to visit her parents. Margaret had grown into a fierce advocate for racial justice herself, and Richard, although reluctant at first, was now fully involved in supporting various foundations and working with politicians to push for policies aimed at creating more economic equality. They'd become pillars of support for Jessica and Daniel, but they were also deeply aware of the dangers they now faced. We're with you, no matter what, Margaret assured Jessica over tea. I know this isn't easy, but your dad and we've seen how far you've come and how far you've taken this fight. You're leading, not just following. And there's nothing more important than that. Jessica smiled faintly, grateful for her parents' newfound dedication, but she still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There would always be people who fought against their progress, people who couldn't bear to see love win. One afternoon, an unlikely ally stepped into their lives, a former adversary. Helen Davenport, the same woman who had once scorned Jessica and Daniel at the country club, reached out with an unexpected apology. Helen? Jessica answered the phone in surprise. What's going on? I need to meet with you, Helen said softly. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I've seen your work. I've seen the lives you've changed, and I'm ashamed of the way I acted in the past. I want to make things right. Will you meet me? Jessica didn't know what to say at first, but she agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe. When Helen sat across from Jessica, she seemed genuinely remorseful. Her posture was different, no longer haughty or self-assured, but humble. I don't know how to begin. I was wrong. I've spent years holding on to biases I didn't even realize I had. And seeing you and Daniel thrive, seeing the impact you've had, I've been forced to confront my own demons. Jessica studied her for a moment, before nodding slowly. I understand. It's not easy, but confronting those biases is how we change. What's important is that you're trying. Helen's eyes welled with tears. I want to help. I want to use my resources to support your initiatives, to help those who are still silenced, ignored, and oppressed. Jessica took a deep breath. This was unexpected, but maybe it was the very change they had been fighting for. Let's work together then. Let's make sure no one else has to go through what we did. Helen's transformation wasn't just an apology. It was a commitment to making things right, however long it took. As the years went by, Jessica and Daniel's activism evolved. They had moved from local and national efforts to creating a global network of organizations dedicated to fighting systemic racism, advocating for human rights, and ensuring equality for marginalized communities worldwide. Yet, there were still moments of doubt. They'd been at the forefront of change for so long, but the weight of it all was beginning to feel overwhelming. One day, Amelia, now an adult, came to visit her parents, bringing with her her own children. She had followed her parents' example, becoming a powerful advocate for change in her own right. But now, with children of her own, the pressure was beginning to weigh on her too. Mom, Dad, Amelia said softly as they sat together in their living room. I'm so proud of everything you've done, but I'm scared. I don't want my children to grow up in a world still full of hate. Jessica took a deep breath, her heart aching. Amelia, we can't control the future, but we can shape it. Every generation has its challenges. But the reason we keep fighting is for them, to ensure that they'll inherit a world that's better than the one we grew up in. Daniel nodded. We might not see it all in our lifetime, sweetheart, but every step forward is progress. And that's the legacy we leave. Amelia smiled, tears in her eyes. I see it now. I see what you've built, and I want to keep that going. I want my children to know that change is possible. And in that moment, they realized that the true legacy wasn't just in the programs, the policies, or the awards. The legacy was in the hearts of the next generation, who would carry their message forward with even more passion, even more drive. As they entered the twilight years of their lives, Jessica and Daniel faced one final challenge. A powerful voice in their community, a political figure who had been an ally for years, announced a shift in priorities, one that threatened to undo much of the progress Jessica and Daniel had worked so hard for. This new figure advocated for policies that favored the wealthy, minimized the struggles of marginalized communities, and rolled back some of the racial justice reforms they had fought for. The challenge was more than political, it was personal. The thought of watching the world regress felt like a cruel betrayal. "This might be our hardest battle yet," Jessica said, standing with Daniel in their office, staring at the news headlines. "How do we fight against something so deeply entrenched?" Daniel sighed. "We've fought battles before, Jess. This isn't the first time we've faced resistance. We fight the way we always have, with love, with unity, and with action." And so, even as they grew older, even as they faced the pressures of time and change, Jessica and Daniel doubled down. They knew the fight for equality and justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. And they were more determined than ever to ensure that their children, grandchildren, and future generations would inherit a world where love truly had the power to change everything. It had been years since Jessica and Daniel had returned from their international assignment. Their efforts had truly begun to reshape the conversations about race, wealth, and inequality. But now, another challenge emerged. One of the most powerful political figures in the country, Senator Charles Woodman, had been a key ally in their initiatives. He had supported their work through legislation, helped them navigate governmental channels, and had even spoken at some of their fundraising events. However, as the political climate shifted, he began to move away from the social justice reforms that had been their core message. One afternoon, Daniel received an urgent call. It was a press release from Senator Woodman's office, announcing a policy proposal that directly contradicted everything they had fought for over the years. "Damn it," Daniel muttered, reading the document aloud. "This isn't just a minor shift, this is a complete betrayal." Jessica joined him in front of the television, her face falling as she saw the headline flash across the screen. "Senator Woodman supports bill that undermines racial justice progress." This is not just about politics. This is about undoing everything we've built, she said, anger rising in her chest. But then, something unexpected happened. After hours of public outcry and media backlash, the senator asked to meet with Jessica and Daniel personally. He requested a private dinner at his office. At the dinner, the senator was not his usual confident, aloof self. There was a noticeable weight on his shoulders. "I understand why you're upset," he began, looking down at his hands. "But things have become more complicated than I anticipated. The political pressure is overwhelming. The shift in the electorate has forced me to make choices I'm not proud of." Daniel leaned forward. "Don't tell us you're doing this for political gain. You've been one of our strongest allies. What happened?" Woodman sighed deeply, his voice breaking slightly. "I underestimated the forces against us. They've been plotting this for years. It's not just about me. It's about a movement. A movement to dismantle everything you've worked for." Jessica was silent for a moment. "You knew what this would mean for us, for our families, and you chose a side." The senator nodded slowly. "I've realized too late that I was trying to make everyone happy when I should have stuck to my principles. I was wrong. I need your help. I don't know if I can turn this around alone." Jessica and Daniel exchanged a glance, contemplating his request. There was a silence between them, one that stretched long, filled with the weight of years spent fighting for the very cause Woodman had abandoned. "All right," Daniel said finally. "We'll help you. But it's going to take more than words. You need to act." and you need to be prepared to lose everything to make it right. Jessica nodded in agreement. No more half measures. If we're in, we're all in. Over the next few months, the trio worked together in a coordinated effort to dismantle the bill and counteract the damage. With Jessica and Daniel's expertise and the senator's platform, they launched a campaign to rally the public against the bill. Speaking out at rallies and organizing protests, their hard work paid off when the bill was defeated, and Senator Woodman, while forever tarnished by his prior actions, publicly apologized for his mistakes and vowed to do better. As the years passed, Jessica and Daniel's children began to find their own paths in the world of activism. Amelia, now in her 30s, had already become a respected leader in the fight for racial justice and economic equality, taking on high-profile cases, leading national campaigns, and mentoring younger activists. However, as she continued to grow in prominence, she began to feel the pressure of living up to the legacy of her parents. She had watched them endure so much and had always admired their resolve. But now, as a leader in her own right, the expectations felt overwhelming. "Mom, Dad," Amelia said one evening, calling her parents to their home. "I'm honored to carry this torch, but I'm also scared. What if I can't live up to what you've done? What if I fail?" Jessica, now in her late 50s, smiled gently at her daughter. "You've been carrying this torch for years, sweetheart. You are your own person. You don't have to follow in our footsteps. You're creating your own path." Daniel added, "The truth is, you're already doing it. You've built your own platform. You've inspired people in ways we never could. What's important now is that you stay true to who you are." Amelia took a deep breath. "But what if I'm not enough?" "You are enough," Jessica said, her voice firm and steady. "And no matter how hard it gets, you're never alone in this fight." Amelia smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had always known her parents had her back, but hearing it again made all the difference. As the years went on, they saw the younger generation of activists, young leaders of color rising up to continue the work. Jessica and Daniel had always known their fight would be passed on, but now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. They were witnessing the birth of a new movement, one that was fearless, passionate, and unafraid to push boundaries. Their children were no longer just heirs to a cause. They were driving it forward, creating a future they could be proud of. As Jessica and Daniel neared their retirement years, they often found themselves reflecting on everything they had been through, the struggles, the triumphs, the heartbreaks, and the victories. One night, after an emotional interview where both had been invited to speak about their journey, they sat on their porch, watching the sunset together. Their children and grandchildren had gone home for the evening, leaving the couple to enjoy a rare moment of quiet. "I can't believe how far we've come, Daniel," Jessica said softly, leaning against him. "I remember when we first started all this, when the world seemed so much smaller, so much more divided. We fought so hard for so many people, but it all feels worth it now." Daniel looked out at the horizon, a contented smile on his face. "It's been a long road, but we've made it. And we've left the world better than we found it." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling around them. Their work wasn't over, but they had given it everything they had. They had fought for their love, their families, their communities, and for a better future. And as they watched the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, they knew one thing for certain: they had truly changed the world. Time had a way of creeping up on people. Jessica and Daniel had spent decades fighting for justice, traveling the world, mentoring new activists, and helping to shape policies that supported racial and economic equality. But now, for the first time in years, they felt the weight of time pressing down on them. One morning, Daniel woke up feeling an unusual tightness in his chest. At first, he brushed it off, but as the weeks went by, the pain became more frequent. Jessica noticed the subtle ways he tried to hide it, The way he clutched his ribs when he thought she wasn't looking. How he took deeper breaths when standing up. The way he avoided long walks. Finally, after much pushing from Jessica and their children, Daniel agreed to see a doctor. The news was sobering. "You've been ignoring this for too long," the doctor told him with a serious look. "Your heart is strong, but it's been under immense stress for years. If you don't slow down, the consequences could be severe." Daniel sighed. He had spent his life pushing forward, fighting against the odds. Slowing down had never been an option. But now, he realized, his family needed him to take care of himself just as much as he had taken care of others. Jessica held his hand tightly as they walked out of the hospital. "It's time we start thinking about the future, Danny," she said softly. "We can't do this forever. Maybe it's time to step back, just a little." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with both reluctance and understanding. "I don't know how to stop, Jess." She smiled gently. "We don't have to stop. We just need to pass the torch." Jessica and Daniel made the difficult decision to step back from the front lines of activism. They weren't quitting, but they were shifting their roles, becoming mentors, advisors, and storytellers rather than direct leaders. They formally handed over their foundation to a group of young, passionate activists, including their daughter Amelia. Under her leadership, the organization expanded further than they ever imagined. Amelia stood before a crowd of thousands at her first official speech as the new director. Jessica and Daniel watched from the front row, feeling a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "My parents taught me that change isn't a moment, it's a movement," Amelia said into the microphone. "They built a bridge between the past and the future, and now it's time for us to walk across it." The crowd erupted in applause. Jessica felt tears well up in her eyes. It wasn't just about her and Daniel anymore. Their love story, their struggles, their victories, it had all led to something much greater than themselves. Daniel squeezed her hand. "We did good, didn't we?" Jessica wiped away a tear. "More than good. We built something that will last beyond us." One evening many years later, Jessica and Daniel received an unexpected visitor, someone from their past who they never thought they'd see again. It was Paul Lancaster, Jessica's old ex-fiancé. The same man who had once told her she was ruining her future by being with Daniel. The same man who had walked away from her when she chose love over comfort. Jessica was stunned as she opened the door to find him standing there, looking older but still recognizable. "Paul," she said, her voice laced with surprise. Paul gave a nervous smile. "I know this is unexpected, but I had to see you, both of you." Jessica invited him in, and Daniel, although wary, welcomed him as well. Paul sat down in their living room, his hands clasped together. "I spent years resenting you," he admitted. "I was so sure that you were making a mistake, that you'd regret your choices. But now, after all these years, after everything you've done, I see that I was the one who was wrong." Jessica and Daniel exchanged a glance. They had long since moved past the pain Paul had caused, but hearing his words still meant something. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry," Paul continued. "I see now what I couldn't see back then. You weren't ruining your life, you were changing the world, and I was too blind to understand it." Jessica took a deep breath. "Paul, I appreciate that. It took a lot for you to come here." Paul nodded. "It did. But I needed to say it." Daniel extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Paul shook it. "People can change," Daniel said simply. Paul smiled. "Yeah, they can." As he left that night, Jessica and Daniel sat in silence for a while, reflecting on how much time had passed, how much had changed. Life had a funny way of bringing closure in the most unexpected ways. Years later, Jessica and Daniel found themselves standing at the opening of a new museum exhibit dedicated to the fight for racial justice. Among the displays of historical figures and activists, there was an entire section dedicated to their story. Jessica traced her fingers over an old photograph of her and Daniel from their college years. The same photo that had once caused an uproar in her family. The same photo that had once symbolized controversy, but now stood as a testament to love's power to change the world. A young girl, no older than 15, stood beside them, reading their story on the museum plaque. She turned to Jessica, not realizing who she was, and said, "Wow, they must have been really brave." Jessica smiled. "They were." The girl looked up at her. "Do you think things are better now because of them?" Jessica thought about it for a moment. The world was far from perfect. Racism still existed. Injustice still thrived. But there was also hope, progress, and a generation that refused to stop fighting. She turned to the girl and said, "Yes, and because of you, they'll get even better." The girl beamed, and Jessica squeezed Daniel's hand as they walked away. They had lived a lifetime of battles, of love, of victories and defeats. But through it all, they had won. Not just for themselves, but for generations to come. And that, above all else, was their greatest legacy. As the years passed, Jessica and Daniel's influence continued to grow. Their names became synonymous with change, progress, and the fight for racial justice. Documentaries were made about their story. Books were written about their struggles. And their foundation had become one of the most powerful civil rights organizations in the country. Then, one day, Jessica and Daniel received a letter and invitation from the President of the United States. They were to be honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the country. The news spread like wildfire. Journalists from all over the world reached out for interviews, and people who had followed their journey from the beginning celebrated their achievement. On the day of the ceremony, they stood on the grand stage of the White House, holding hands as the president spoke. "Jessica and Daniel's love story is more than just a romance," the president said. "It is a testament to the power of love over hate, courage over fear, and unity over division. Because of them, the world is a better place." As they received their medals, Jessica glanced at Daniel, and they both smiled. They had come a long way from the days when people doubted them, when their love was considered controversial. Now, they were being honored at the highest level of government. It was a full-circle moment, one that proved that love, when rooted in justice, could change the world. Just as they thought their lives would be peaceful, an unexpected controversy arose. A well-known political commentator, known for his inflammatory views, released a scathing book criticizing their legacy. He claimed that their success was exaggerated and that their story had been manipulated by the media. He went so far as to say that their interracial marriage was used as propaganda to push a political agenda. The backlash was immediate. Supporters of Jessica and Daniel were outraged, but their enemies saw an opportunity to rewrite history. Their daughter, Amelia, wanted to take legal action, but Jessica and Daniel stopped her. "Fighting him only gives him power," Daniel said. "The truth is stronger than lies." Instead of reacting with anger, they responded with action. They opened their archives, released unseen footage of their struggles, and invited journalists to interview the people whose lives they had changed. They didn't just defend themselves. They let the truth speak for itself. Within weeks, the false narrative crumbled. The commentator's book was discredited, and public support for Jessica and Daniel grew stronger than ever. Amelia shook her head in amazement. "You always know how to handle things with grace," she said to her parents. Jessica smiled. "We've been fighting for too long to let one loud voice shake us." As the years continued to pass, Jessica and Daniel realized that they were nearing the end of their journey. Their foundation had grown beyond what they could have imagined. New leaders had taken over, carrying the torch into the next generation. It was time to say goodbye. They held a farewell event, a celebration of their decades of activism. Thousands attended, including young activists who have been inspired by their story. Jessica took the stage first. She looked out at the crowd, filled with people of all backgrounds, and took a deep breath. "When I was young, I was afraid," she said. "Afraid to love Daniel, afraid to stand against my family, afraid to fight for what was right. But I learned something powerful. Fear fades when love takes its place." Daniel stepped forward. "We've given our lives to this fight, but it was never just about us. It was about all of you, about the world we leave behind. And now, we know that it is in good hands." The audience rose in a standing ovation, many in tears. Their impact would never be forgotten. Years later, Jessica and Daniel had grown old together. They spent their days in a peaceful home, surrounded by family, watching their grandchildren grow. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Daniel took Jessica's hand. "We did everything we set out to do," he said softly. Jessica nodded. "And more." They sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on a lifetime of love and purpose. That night, Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep. Jessica, though heartbroken, found comfort in knowing that their love had lasted until the very end. At his funeral, thousands gathered to pay their respects. Leaders, activists, and everyday people who had been touched by his work shared their memories. Jessica took the stage one last time. "My husband was not just a leader," she said through tears. "He was a man who loved fiercely, fought bravely, and never gave up on what was right. And though he is gone, his spirit lives on in all of us." She looked out at the crowd. "So I ask you, will you continue his fight?" A wave of voices rose in unison. "Yes!" Jessica smiled through her tears. Daniel was gone, but his legacy would never die.